So my whole life, people have commented on my memory for facts. When I was a kid, my mother would say I had a memory like a steel trap. People would always ask me, how do you remember this? And as a kid, obviously, I had no idea. But as I've studied cognitive science and I've learned more, I have some idea, and I think it's probably three things. And today I want to focus mostly on one of those. So one of the factors, I think, is I probably have synesthesia, which I've talked about how my probably favorite living nonfiction writer is Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And in his book Anti-Fragile, which I did not pull, oh, it's over there on that shelf, I believe it is, he talked about having synesthesia, and until that point, I never wondered if I might. And as I've looked into it more, I think I probably do, but it's hard to tell because there's so many kinds. And if you don't know what synesthesia is, it is associating things that most people would not associate, like sensory-wise. And so, like, a friend of mine would complain about on the TV and in movies where you would have people who were crazy or crazy geniuses, that they would, like, visualize stuff in front of them and move it all around. And she would say, no one thinks like that. And I'd be like, I think like that. I don't use my hands, like, I'm using my mind, but otherwise, I feel like that's a pretty good representation of how I think and how I visualize things. And I've realized this is very close to the memory palace method that people who have taught themselves to be good at memorizing facts have used. And then another contributing factor, I think, and this is probably the least important, but it is probably a factor, is that you tend to remember things more that are emotionally salient, and generally, especially like negative things. And most people don't have episodic memories before 7 and rarely before 3. And I have quite a few before 3. And I think probably that's because they were negatively emotional to me. And certainly a lot of things that I remember have negative emotional salience, and a lot of facts I remember, it's because they have some impact on me. And I used to, when I would take the Big Five, I would score at the top, like 99th percentile for neuroticism, roughly. And since my father died, I've gotten a lot more average on that. But I think that was probably a contributing factor too. But I think the biggest thing and the easiest thing to replicate is that I have tended to think in terms of frameworks. And when I was in undergrad, I used to just call these all heuristics. Now I would say a heuristic is a rule of thumb, which is often part of a larger framework. But I would say a framework is more a way of looking at the world. And Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which I finally started reading, and it's downstairs, so I'm not going to grab it. But he talks about paradigms, which I'm realizing seem to have a lot of overlap. But the critical thing is most people, so I've talked about frameworks as being like different maps of the territory. And most people, for one piece of territory, will typically have one map. And I've always recognized that there are multiple maps that can apply, even if I don't hold to them. Like one thing for me is big part of why I stopped believing in God for about 20 years was because of encountering young Earth creationism, which was based on biblical literalism, biblical inerrancy, and sola scriptura. And I didn't really know how to answer this, and the adults I talked to were reassuring me, yeah, it doesn't contradict the Bible. And I'm like, okay, but these televangelists are pointing to the Bible itself to defend these things, and they were not getting that I wasn't asking about evolution, I was asking about the mechanisms that these televangelists were using to defend evolution. And so I got interested in theology, even though I didn't believe. And I realized that if I believed in all three of these things, my reading of the Bible would be very close to the Christadelphians. And so I was fascinated by the fact that the vast majority of people who claim to believe all three of these things of sola scriptura, which is standard, pretty common in Protestantism, biblical literalism, and biblical inerrancy all together, typically don't believe most of the things that make Christadelphianism distinctive. And likewise, I understood young Earth creationism as coherent as a system in itself. I thought it was wrong, but based on using the Bible as the supreme word for understanding this, I'm like, yeah, it sort of hangs together, including the supposedly scientific aspects of that. And as I've gotten older, I realized I have just a lot of these frameworks. Like, there's different ways of looking at things, and there's typically one that I prefer. And I'm going to have a lot to say about Michael Polanyi. I just read this book. He's been like at the top of my list of people I've wanted to read whose books were in print, but I didn't buy them because they were generally pricey. But I bought a couple of them used, which I haven't gotten here yet. And this one is from Liberty Fund, which generally has pretty cheap books. And this one is print on demand, so it's not as nice as their books, but it's still decent. And it was like $15. And this has been a really impactful book that I have a lot to say about. But one of the things that he tries to make clear to people is that if you want to understand science, you need to understand that science is one framework for looking at the world. And we choose to believe science is the best framework for answering empirical questions. But witchcraft astrology, frameworks like that are still coherent frameworks internally to the people who believe them. And science might be replaced by another framework, or the frameworks that we've rejected might make a comeback, and we need to keep that in mind. And so I've always had this tendency to just recognize there are multiple perspectives, and even if I'm not adhering to one of these worldviews, and even if I'm frustrated, I don't understand why people would, I've still understood that. And so a lot of the facts that I remember, it's because they are part of these frameworks, part of these maps. And I've noticed, like, generally what I remember are either things that are inherently, they sort of cohere with the framework and they're the obvious conclusion. And that's, I'm probably not remembering the detail. I'm just doing like LLMs generally do and inferring that this framework would predict this outcome. And I also remember when you have conclusions that seem counterintuitive, contradictory to the framework, because those stand out. And the facts that I tend to forget the most often are the ones that are consistent with several predictions in a framework, so they don't really align to one framework. And so I think this is a big part of how I remember so many facts. And so you'll see a lot of people saying that, like J.J. McCullough, for example, has said, and I think I can actually do other people's videos, so I'll see if I can do that. But J.J. McCullough has argued that the most important thing in education should be accumulating facts. And I think that's an important part of early education, but it should still be in the context of the frameworks in which these facts are useful and applicable. And like, I remember a lot more facts than most people. And it's, I mean, one of the things is I'm not obsessed with trying to remember where did I learn this and what are the exact details. I'm remembering the fact as how does it fit into this framework, or how does it seem to contradict this framework? And that seems to be a big factor in how I remember these things. And I've always sort of been interested in trying to understand different frameworks, different ways of looking at the world. I've gotten way more into that recently, and I will have several videos on that. But I wanted to introduce this idea, which is, again, I think if you want to understand the world, and if you want to remember more facts, understanding that different maps can apply to the same territory for different purposes is a critical element of that. And one interesting thing is, so Daniel Everett in the book Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes talks about the Piraha would see these supernatural creatures that we couldn't see. And Polanyi actually talks about, like, there are things that we just are used to not seeing. We don't see the blind spot in front of our face. We don't see the floaties in our eyes most of the time. We're used to just not seeing what we expect to see. And I've realized, like, a lot of the time, if I didn't have a framework that would encompass new information, when people would give me new information, I would not process what they were saying. And the same thing with arguments. I would not even understand the argument. I would fit it into the argument that I thought they were making as opposed to the argument they were actually making. And so for me, I think this approach of perspectivism, of understanding different frameworks and how different facts can fit into them, because one thing you'll find is, like, a lot of disputes often agree on most of the facts, but they disagree on how to prioritize the facts. There may be some facts that are in dispute, but it's most of the argument is just about how to prioritize facts that most people agree on, or at least, like, in the generalities. And the specifics may matter in the framing, but it's often, it's people being pedantic, and it's the how do people put these facts together in their interpretation, because no set of facts can lead to any interpretation about what that means, what to do about it, unless you have a framework for interpreting it. But people tend to assume that the framework they have been taught for a given field, basically, a given field of human life, is the one that they should be using. And when you recognize that there's multiple frameworks, and the one I'm using, as Polanyi would say, is more useful to me, but it's not the only possible one, well, that makes it easier to remember the facts that might call what you believe into question and say, okay, actually, this framework that I find morally offensive and factually, epistemologically indefensible might still be wrong, but it can shed insight into things I believe and realize, oh, the framework I was following isn't quite right. And you can modify that and self-correct in a way that you really can't if you only have one framework per area of what you're looking at. So anyways, wanted to talk about that quickly. I'll definitely have more to say about this idea, but thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and we'll see y'all in the next one.